Hello and welcome. My name is Kathy Rath, and I am hosting tonight's event. Thank you for joining us this evening to launch Labyrinth of the Wind, a novel of love and nuclear secrets by Madhav Misra. We're really excited to have you today. To our loyal patrons out there, we continue to appreciate your support of independent bookstores and all that they significantly mean for communities here and across the country. So we really appreciate that. And for the newbies out there, glad you made it. Please check on bookpassage.com for our upcoming summer and fall events. We have a calendar all set up. We will actually, this is very exciting news, we'll be relaunching our in-person event starting in September. So it'll be wonderful to see you all locals again in person. So great. And I haven't been around for a little bit, and so I'm just so excited to be here. Tonight we have a very special in conversation format. So that will be where our in conversation interviewer will be speaking with Madhav, and we will then open it up for questions. So please start at any point during the in conversation. If you got a question that's burning, please put it, or a comment, please put it in the chat. And as the process moves along, Fred will pick up those questions and we'll have you guys enjoying the conversation. And then once that's through, I will return to close out the event this evening. So again, thanks for joining. So let me get started here. Author Madhav, I said that right. Madhav Misra grew up in India. He graduated with an honors degree in economics at St. Stephen's College, and 4 years later, obtained an advanced degree in finance and a job offer in Tehran. As the CFO of a multinational energy corporation, he lived in Tehran during the onset of the Iranian Revolution. So just imagine that. He left Tehran on one of the last commercial flights in 1978, 3 weeks before the Shah fled. So I'm pulling this in because Labyrinth of the Wind's protagonist, Ayan, an Indian expat, is the chief financial officer of an Iranian power company, enjoying the many luxurious perks of the job with his girlfriend, Gaby. She is an airline pilot who covertly sympathizes with the radical leftists in her native Germany. The story is actually set in 1977, and the Iranian Revolution is about to overthrow the Shah's pro-Western monarchy in favor of an Islamic theocracy led by Ayatollah Khomeini. That's all I will say right now, except that this is a suspenseful work of historical fiction that focuses on choices and consequences at a time of huge political upheaval. Now, interviewing Madhav tonight is Fred Ritzenberg, an award-winning screenwriter and producer of all kinds of films, including Zaytoon. You could see that in the poster behind him, which was a runner-up for the People's Choice Award at the Toronto International Film Festival. He's written screenplays for many top-tiered Hollywood producers and currently teaches screenwriting and is the dean of the San Francisco Film School. So what a combination we have tonight. I would say that a couple of reviews, Kirkus Reviews says, our verdict, get it. Misra's tale is an historically authentic as it is dramatically engrossing, complex, moving, and edifying. San Francisco Book Review, Misra writes elegantly and captures the audience's attention on the first page. Labyrinth of the Wind is an exhilarating read. So without further ado, take it away, Fred.
Thank you, Kathy, and thank Book Passage also for hosting this event. And Madhav, congratulations on writing a great first novel. So let me start off with the most obvious question, which is you had a successful career in finance. What motivated you to write this book?
Well, thanks, Fred, and thank Book Passages. Uh, I, for the longest time, wanted to tell the story of a cohort of Indians that came of age in the early 70s that were very different from the members of their family. Enough time had passed since the independence, since the partition of India, and so the conservative, cautious mindset of families uh, had given way to allowing their children to develop into and follow paths of their choosing. And a lot of us set forth to try to live our imagined lives, essentially to try to live like Americans, with no constraints in pursuit of whatever dreams. And a lot of us had an idea of America, whether it was an idea inspired by Bobby Kennedy, Martin Luther King, or Dylan and Joplin. Uh, it was different strokes for different people. And I wanted to give voice to that Indian because there are several of us around the world. And over the years, I found that it was not just the Indians that formed this cohort, but it was a global English speaking state of mind, almost a nation state of mind that was inspired by the same things, really responding to it was an echo of the anti-Vietnam protests in America in the late 60s, early 70s. And the music of protest and the spirit of revolution that was sweeping the globe along with the possibilities that came about. So, I want to write about that. And I also want to write a story coming from a large family. A lot of us have uh, stories within us about people who are getting old. And I wanted to capture some of those stories before it was too late. And as my business career progressed, I thought, well, there's so many stories I want to tell about the intrigues of corporate life and the compromises of corporate life. And then I landed smack in the middle of a revolution. So I said, well, as I reflected on what I had been through, both the sybaritic times under the Shah, just the high life where Tehran was one of the hot spots of the world, along with Havana and Beirut and Rio. It was one of these watering holes. And then suddenly it was a place you had to get out of, in a hurry. So those four ideas were in my head. And so I said, well, and I said, well, why not sit down and find some time to write about them? And eventually I got that chance. That I had a block of time where I could start thinking about putting pen to paper.
So you lived in Tehran. And so I guess I'm wondering how much of this is drawn from your life experience versus fictionalized?
Well, it is, first of all, it is a work of fiction, but a lot of things in the book actually happened. For example, it follows a timeline of events that actually happened. I was involved in the energy complex. We were supporting the Shah's expansion into nuclear power, mammoth expansion, and we were very much part of planning that. There was this atomic energy organization of Iran the Shah had created that had 1,500 of the highest paid government employees of Iran. There was this entity called NUFCOR SA, Nuclear Fuels Corporation of Africa, that had been formed by a consortium of South African gold mining companies to sell the yellow cake, uranium's yellow cake produced as a byproduct of gold mining. And to this date, all the uranium that Iran has can be traced back to the purchases that the Shah made in in between 75 and 78. So all those things actually happened. And there are some characters who are real in this book, particularly the parents, the driver, modeled after a real person, the colonel was drawn from my real life experience with Savak, not as dramatic as Ayan's, but but the rest of it was imagination and made up, and I'll stop there. I don't know if you have any, if that explains or answers your question, Fred.
Okay. Yes, it does. So we know that character flaws make characters relatable and complicated. So what are the character flaws in Ayan, your protagonist, that make him a great character to work with, that give you material? And how do his character flaws motivate the story, providing you with a narrative drive?
Well, Ayan did not think of himself as flawed, obviously. He thought he was misunderstood. And he was on this, to him, heroic journey of self-discovery, following a time-tested Indian approach, under the Hindu stages of life. He was in the early stages of exploration and education. But the flaw that he developed as a result of his backstory was identifying financial independence as an essential path to achieving true independence, or for him to do the things he really wanted to do. And that led to him obviously opening him up to being exploited. And so that was kind of one of his biggest flaw. The other thing was he failed to understand that this nation, the English-speaking nation state of mind that he thought he was part of, didn't have his constraints, which were very much the constraints of somebody from the developing world, the constraints of visa and opportunities, and he failed to imagine if things like recessions, depressions, or a boss's ultimatum. He failed to understand or imagine what could happen to him and think through the consequences of that. So some people say he was naive. It could be, maybe he was learning. And then finally, he thought he was post-colonial in a sense that he was not enamored of the colonial way of life and was actually very proud of India's independence. But many things about him were truly metropolitan, where he really wanted to be part of the Western world. And the Iranians have a term for that. It's called garbzadegi, West toxification, being overly enamored of the West. And a very interesting Iranian philosopher who was key to the Iranian Revolution, Ali Shariarti, who was educated at Sorbonne, and who was actually the intellectual partner of the Ayatollah Khomeini in creating this revolution. He sort of counseled Iranians about this garbzadegi, this West toxification. And Ayan certainly had that failing. So these are the four of his character flaws. He probably has others, and as people read the book, they point out other flaws to me, which is fine, but they led to a lot of his decisions and the difficulties he placed himself in.
Okay. Um, so we all agree that plot grows out of character. Um, Ayan makes a decision that's a poor choice, mostly because good decisions equal no story. Can you tell us about that choice, which was to help his boss, the CEO of Iran Power, procure uranium for the Shah's nuclear weapons program? Did he have reservations? Did he struggle with the dilemma? And how did you use that to drive the plot of your story?
Well, yes, he had reservations. You know, he knew he was being played. He was being put in a no-win situation, and he did resent that. And people very important to him, his mother, Gaby, he knew were anti-proliferation. He knew that. Uh, and he worried a little for a little while about, nuclear weapons being in wrong hands, but not for too long. And he justified his decision with this anti-colonial mindset he had, which was, and one part of it, which was developed by an important incident in 1971 during the liberation of Bangladesh, which was seared into his memory, where Nixon and Kissinger threatened Indira Gandhi with the Seventh Fleet and the USS Enterprise if she continued to support the liberation of Bangladesh and to make sure that she did not make a move onto West Pakistan. And people should read about this. There's a document called the Blood Telegram by Mr. Blood, who that details the sacrifices Nixon and Kissinger were ready to make and were making for the sake of Yahya Khan, the ruler of Pakistan, helping them with the path to China. So he was the bridge to China, and they were determined. And they had such a low opinion of Indira Gandhi and of Indians. If you look at the declassified documents around that time, it is startling. The language is terrible. They were so dismissive of her. And luckily for India, and luckily for her, luckily mostly for Bangladesh, India had signed in August 71 a friendship treaty with the Soviet Union, and Brezhnev had reassured Indira Gandhi that he would come to India's aid if it was forced into war. Well, that happened when Pakistan attacked India, the West Pakistan, during December 71. And then the British actually were in cohorts with the Americans, and they were sending naval firepower towards Mumbai now. And what happened was Brezhnev ordered his portions of the Soviet Pacific Fleet into the Bay of Bengal, protected by nuclear-armed submarines. And Kissinger walked into Nixon's office and said, "Our bluff has been called. And if we pursue this any further, we will lose." And the Seventh Fleet left immediately. And that lesson Indira Gandhi learned, and was a key, reports say, and I'm familiar with the Gandhi family, it was key in her decision to test India's first nuclear bomb in 1974, at Pokhran, Smiling Buddha. And Indians were astonished that it was successful, astonished that it happened, and felt very, very proud. And it was an important part of India really shaking off its colonial fears. And Ayan thought about that as he thought about the Shah. And he said, well, why not Iran? And he had the view that science and technology cannot be contained. Eventually, these techniques are going to spread. What he failed to understand and think through is that the Shah was a safe pair of hands, but what about, he did not think about a revolution. And so that was another one of his mistakes. But I'm giving you the backdrop for his decision. So in his mind, he was making an acceptable decision. He would get along and play along and sleep peacefully as a result.
Mm-hmm. Except for he didn't sleep so peacefully later on, but we won't get into that.
That's right. Good. Otherwise there wouldn't be a story, right, Fred? And that created,
exactly.
Correct.
So we all know that writers are opportunists and they're always looking for material. So my question is, this is historical fiction. How does the Iranian Revolution overthrowing the Shah and Islamic theocracy direct your story? Or how did you have that push your story and also make it relevant today?
Yeah, it was it provided a timeline, Fred. It provided the timeline, the 1 year, because the events start in October of 77, which is when Khomeini's son was killed in Najaf, Iraq, by some say Savak, triggering the first protests. And the week before that, Germany had been brought to its knees by the killing of Schleyer, who was head of the German industries, by the Bader Meinhof group, to try to free their comrades who were in jail. And those were just sort of maybe a week to 10 days apart. And then the Iranian Revolution really took hold early December of 78. So it provided that timeline for both Ayan and Gaby and the story. And also it really allowed me to explore moral ambiguities and choices and ambivalence of flawed protagonists, in a time or in these kind of times. And it's wonderful, it's a wonderful setting, and many writers have used that. For example, Graham Greene in The Quiet American has used that very successfully. Several others have. And so within that backdrop, I could really explore the values of many different characters. And so it was very important in the overall structure of the story. I would say it's the only part of this novel that was actually mapped out. I had the timeline in my, written down in front of me, all the major events. And often I would have to say, well, I've moved away from this timeline because the characters, once they were fully formed, it's a cliche to say that, Fred, but they did what they did and they had to do. But I had to then, from time to time, bring them back to within the key markers of the revolution. And how is it relevant today? The second part of your question. Well, it was one of the most important events in the latter part of the 20th century, because it proved to many people, insurgents, as well as Islamists and others, that political Islam could be a governing force. So you had capitalism, you had communism, and political Islam. It demonstrated to the world that could be a viable government. And so even today now, you have that aspiration. You look at Afghanistan and the fact that, what we're worrying about right now is that the Taliban will try to introduce that in Afghanistan. But they would not have dared, I believe, and many people do, to have thought about that unless they had the model of the Ayatollah Khomeini in Iran. So it's very relevant to today. And also a lot of the hotspots, for example, Hezbollah, Iran supports Hezbollah, and is pro-government in Syria. destabilizing, some would say, Lebanon, fighting the Saudis in Yemen, and distracting the whole world with their nuclear issues. So it's one of the two big foreign policies in the world today. One is, of course, what to do about China, and the other is what to do about Iran. Mm-hmm. And that all goes back to 1 year, 1977 to 1978. And two people, two real people, Ali Shariarty, who brought the middle class and intelligentsia in. And people should really read about him. He was a tremendously charismatic figure, friend of Frantz Fanon, and then the Ayatollah Khomeini, the fearless Ayatollah Khomeini.
I think you wove that in very well, actually. So political stories are tricky. I did a political movie, and it was, it was a hot potato. How did you handle coming down in the middle, not taking sides? We know that being pedantic makes us gag and kills the drama, but you handled it so well. I'm wondering what you did in order to kind of tweak that and land in the middle without it feeling one-sided.
Well, that was one of my biggest challenges, Fred. And I'd love to hear how you handled that wonderfully in Zaytoon. But, my first draft, even my second draft, had way too much political exposition. And I think that's where a good editor, and my wife who was my editor and my sternest critic, she has lots of red pens, and so she cut out a lot, and I fought her on that. And then my writing group at Stanford, as well as the lecturers at Stanford's writers program, they also said, look, you've got, this all has to be in the background. And so I thought about that, and I said, look, so many people that I really respect are saying the same thing. So I've got to then really cut out all of that. And I probably cut out 50 pages, 60 pages of hard work, and maybe a year of work. I just cut that out and had belief in the fact that Gaby was so politically driven, Hamid was so politically driven, that these two, so much was happening in the backdrop, both in Germany as well as in Iran, that just their obsessions and focus, and Ayan being dragged into their world, would provide enough of the backdrop. And I think that's actually what happened. I'm glad I trusted that, and I'm really glad I had a great editor and also a great developmental editor in Tom Parker, as well as all my friends at Stanford who helped me write the book. And now tell us about Zaytoon, though. How did you handle that challenge?
Well, it's interesting because our writer was Palestinian, and he had an agenda. And when a writer has an agenda, that's the end of the world. So, he wanted to incorporate all of these slogans and this pedantic narrative. And, I was told by a friend who's a great screenwriter, Clay Froman, look, the camera finds the politics. You don't need to describe it. And so we ended up, and through the director's insistence, because we had an Israeli director, we got rid of all of that stuff and just focused on the drama. And in fact, the camera does find the politics, and then let the viewer ultimately make the decision.
You have said, in the past, that screenwriting is very different from from writing a novel. You know, and I wonder if you'd care to elaborate on that.
Well, yeah, I mean, because we have to externalize the internal. And so we don't have the benefit of backstory, and we don't have the benefit of giving out information about the character other than through their actions. And so it's very different. Although when I read your story is very cinematic, and I can see how it would make a wonderful film. You know, you've got Atlanta burning in the background. It's a great, you know, catalyst. It's a great trigger. This is a time of change. And so, and you also write very descriptively, and you did your research in this, obviously, because it feels very authentic. But you know, once you make that leap, that adaptation from book to film, it's all in the actions of the character, which actually leads me to a question for you,
Yes.
which is Gaby, Ayan's love interest, is a strong and independent woman, not without her own flaws. She's obsessed with Bader Meinhof. So my question is, what made you choose Gaby's connection with the leftist movement in Germany? And how did it enrich and motivate her character? And most importantly, cause conflict with Ayan?
You know, it is maybe interesting for people to know that the Bader Meinhof movement really had its origins in a visit by the Shah of Iran to West Berlin in 1967. While he was there during the protests, there was a lot of protests, and word had spread that the Shah and his family were living this wonderful life where a lot of Iran was starving. And so the German students had joined the Iranian students who were protesting, and they were and a young a student called Benno Ornes Sorg walked in to see what was happening and got shot. And the image of him lying and being cradled by a woman, you know, I'm not sure who that was, that really triggered outrage amongst the younger Germans, and said, maybe it is true what people are saying. We still have Nazis in our midst. And a year later, in '68, Andreas Bader, who was also moved by that, bombed a couple of department stores to protest consumerism. But there is a direct link. So the 2JM movement, they call it, because it happened at that time. There was that link. So I thought, when I found that out, I said, well, it really intrigued me. And because I was writing about, in a time of the Iranian Revolution. And the other aspect, and then the fact that I had known that a quarter of young Germans supported Bader Meinhof. And a lot of, Monday morning quarterbacks have said that it was brutal, violent, misguided, but they were actually believed they were fighting the spirit of the Nazis who had hidden in the shadows and worked their way up into positions of power in Germany. And so so Gaby, it created a character. And so I thought if Gaby is a supporter of Bader Meinhof, she would have, it just felt that, she would be an even more passionate, interesting person. And then you pair her off with being one of the early pilots in commercial aviation, very, very early pilots in commercial aviation, just opening up to women. I thought that's an interesting aspect to her also. And you know, when I started writing the character and imagining, and I was trying to wonder, you know, and obviously I lived in Iran, and I actually moved in all these expatriate circles and all these clubs, etc. That's in the book. So I interacted with a lot of people. I had little glimpses of people uh, that were like Gaby, and I thought of Charlize Theron, you know, in Mad Max. And so I said, you know, a real take charge lady, beautiful, uh, stunning, but but you look at her as somebody who takes control and have many layers to her. And so that's the reason. So the main reason was that it formed an interesting introduction to the Iranian Revolution and a connection to the Iranian Revolution. So it was not something picked out of left field. And it caused conflict with Ayan because he was very much focused, as I said, on his journey of self-discovery. You know, the classic Indian youth, which I've mentioned. And she was much more focused on changing the world and society, her society, not so much on herself and her journey. So I think that was a big clash and a big cause of conflict because they were being motivated at two different levels. And they're two different ideas of time because of how events were transpiring and Badr was in jail and there was a sense of urgency and all of the Badr Meinhof movement was being hunted down. She, as a supporter of Badr Meinhof, had to act now. Whereas Ayan, for him, time was really stretched out. He had this telescopic perspective. And so the different time perspectives of, you know, led her to think he was ambivalent and selfish. And he thought that she was, well, so obviously he didn't think anything negative about her. He just loved her, so he couldn't imagine anything negative about her. But the clash, she was the one who found a problem, and that this was the problem. The very interesting character to write about once that interest in Badr Meinhof and the connection to the Iranian Revolution was established.
Yeah, I mean, I thought that her association with Badr Meinhof not only created tension with Gaby and Ayan, it also kind of was tense for the reader because we never knew what was going to happen next, if she was going to get busted, if she was going to get revealed, if she was, you know, what the ultimate outcome was going to be of her association. So I think you handled that very well.
Thanks, Fred. But and also it's interesting that if I could add something to it, there are many, and you as a TV guy and a movie guy, you know, there are many sort of episodes of, from Gaby's point of view, where you could imagine, you know, what her motivation was also because in the book, her father comes out as somebody, the generation who supported the Nazis. And I was talking to a German reader of my book who was a little concerned and quite frankly upset that I equated Badr Meinhof, he thought I did, with Savak when he felt Badr Meinhof had been way too violent in a terrible movement in Germany. But he did say that whole interaction between Gaby and her father, he says, there are many books to be written about the children of the soldiers in the Nazi era and how they interacted with their parents. So that's, I just thought I'd mention. And that was, you know, and it adds to Gaby's complexity because once Ayan discovers that, you know, he understands better her need to support Badr Meinhof. She could not break from her father, who she loved dearly, but she could break from everything he held dear by supporting Badr Meinhof.
Right, because he was a Nazi sympathizer. Right. So I'm supposed to ask the audience to pose their questions in chat. So hopefully they've been doing that as we have headed. I've got so many questions I want to ask you. I do want to say that Colonel Haider Hosseini, the poetry-loving Savak, who is the secret police officer watching over Iran power, is a great antagonist. And quickly, can you talk about his point of view and why he's a worthy antagonist?
Sure. So, you know, he was another interesting character to write about. Again, he modeled after my own Savak minder. And, you know, so Hosseini is just believes in the Shah's mission and believes that he has to defend the Shah's rule against all enemies, internal and external. And he truly believes, he's an intelligent man, and he truly believes that the Shah is going to modernize Iran and uplift Iran, and is doing nothing immoral or illegal. And he has also then unlimited power as a Savak man. And that corrupts him in standard ways, you know, where he tortures, he rapes, he kills, but that's never on the surface. It's always hinted at. On the surface, what you see is an urbane, sophisticated man who truly does love poetry, who is actually well-read, who is actually sensitive, and develops a feeling for Ayan in a particular, you know, in a Savak Colonel kind of way, which is maybe the only reason Ayan gets a chance later on in the book to survive. It's because of their poetic banter and their relationship that they develop and the feelings, the connections they have, because he was well read. And he was actually, and this makes him actually more fearsome. You know, it's like the murderer listening to opera as he goes about torturing his victims. You know, that's a trope actually in literature, but it is scary. So I thought that makes him such a worthy antagonist. The fact that he has this unlimited power, but he also has this sensitivity. Now, I'll say one thing quickly. I know we're running out of time. I will say quickly that Savak was actually trained by and developed by Norman Schwarzkopf Sr., the father of the general who's more familiar to us, who was key in Operation Ajax in dethroning Mossadegh and bringing the younger Shah back into power. And to keep him in power, he created this force, Savak, absolutely brutal force. It was created by the CIA, and then later trained further by Mossad. And I'll stop there. I know we can go on, but people can read up about that.
So speaking of that, can you read a little introduction to Colonel Hosseini, which I think is an interesting character and very smarmy character, but it's a great read.
Okay, I know. So I'll do a quick read. Don't mind my speed because I'm trying to stay within our time. Hosseini stood straight as always, stretching his 5 feet 9 inches to the limit. His full head of hair, parted on the right and almost completely gray at 45, was neat. His dark blue suit highlighted his broad shoulders and slim hips. A good tailor had disguised a surprisingly undisciplined waistline. Behind the distinguished look in avuncular potbelly was a Savak enforcer of Iran power. Every major company in Iran had a man from the Shah's secret police in its ranks. Ayan tensed, the killing on Pahlavi Avenue replaying vividly in his mind as the colonel sauntered into his office. A good holiday, Ayan Agha, Hosseini said, his craggy features arranged in their usual sardonic expression. I hear you're having fun, really enjoying our country. I just rest on weekends, Colonel, Ayan said casually, turning his attention to a file on his desk to diminish the man's air of authority. This one was no different. I took a couple of extra days off so I could be here on this Monday, recharged and ready to be worked to death by Iran power again. Bale, bale, the colonel said, smiling. He walked over to Ayan, invading his space with the honey and amber musk of too much Paco Rabanne. Hosseini retrieved a handkerchief from his breast pocket and dusted the portrait of the Shah on the credenza behind Ayan's desk, fidgeting with the frame and the miniature Iranian flag placed next to it until the arrangement satisfied his eye. He patted Ayan's back patronizingly and then returned to neutral territory. Ayan knew what was coming next. Come, sing of wine and minstrels, Hosseini said, his manicured hands punctuating the quote from his legendary hometown poet. Seek less the secrets of life, for none has solved, nor can, this enigma with the logic of mind. The colonel arched an eyebrow and waited, considering Ayan with melancholy brown eyes. He started each morning by opening Hafiz's divan and claimed that the lines his eyes fell on inspired his day. It was a Persian custom, the colonel had said, a characteristic of a poetic people who return to their literary and philosophic greats to knock the dust off their souls. Ayan had learned to respond to him with a quote from Ghalib or Tagore. A note, even though it was ironic, the Sabak man used Hafiz's wisdom for this purpose. A note to sentiment and intuition from the Bengali poet seemed an appropriate follow-up to the Hafiz lines Hosseini had thrown at him. A mind all logic is like a knife all blade, Ayan said mechanically, without the theatrical flourish he normally used to match Hosseini's grandiose presence. It makes the hand bleed that uses it. Hosseini brought his hand to his heart in a gesture of approval. Hele khube, Ayan Agha. I feel a great affection for you, he said. You and I share much. We know that truth is sensed, that only mediocre people try to comprehend life through analysis. They follow straight lines to nowhere. And also we both love beautiful women. Please convey my regards to your friend Gaby, the best looking foreigner in Iran. With your permission, I would enjoy taking her to dinner. He knew she was Ayan's girlfriend, but that meant nothing here. Girlfriend was just an invitation to join in the fun. You've already tried your luck with Gaby, Ayan said, shaking his head and standing up. Why keep getting insulted? He walked the colonel to the door, savoring the 3-inch height advantage he had over the man. Perhaps I have some reason for hope, Hosseini said slyly, and I have important information for you. For now, I leave you with some of Hafiz's wisdom. I make love in hopes this noble art will not disappoint me. For that beauteous face, I pray for a beautiful disposition to keep our heart from any remorse or indisposition. The colonel nodded and exited right towards his office a couple of doors away. Ayan drained the glass of chilled water and turned towards the stack of files on his desk. Workers on forklifts stacked transformers in neat rows in front of the warehouse. Delivery trucks were lined up to take them all across the country and all over the Middle East. He had the finances of a major company under his care. The colonel was just playing his usual games. How about concentrating on his work? But it felt trivial, indecent almost, to work on banalities like inventories, cash flows, and accounts. Images of the morning's events, brutal, shocking, insistent, of dreams bleeding out onto the blacktop of Pahlavi Avenue were all he could think about.
Very nice. Very well done.
Thank you, sir.
So I think I've got so many more questions I want to ask you. But I do have to ask you one really important one, I think, for those of us who are writers. And this question is, did you create your characters and then just kind of trust in the plot growing out of the character? Or did you plot it out, outline it? How did you approach the writing of the book?
Um, I basically wrote this. I'll start quickly. I'll tell you. I wrote this book initially as a nonfiction to begin with, and to tell the stories that I wanted to tell. And as I did a series of workshops at Stanford and got feedback, I got the sense that people suggested that this should be fiction. And one instructor in particular, Nancy Packer, one of the legendary writing instructors at Stanford, said, this has got to be fiction. You've got to free yourself, and you have so much material. And once I sat down and the love story developed, and the characters of Ayan and Gaby were fleshed out, as well as those of Hamid and Hosseini. I followed, the old Hemingway and Scott Fitzgerald's advice, create real people and make them do believable things. So, I tried to do that. I didn't really try too hard. I felt that they quickly became so alive and so real to me. And the situation that was existing around them was so challenging and interesting that the story started running. And as I said, I did nothing else to structure it at all, except bring it back to fit within the timeline. So it was really, it's a cliche to say that the characters decide the story, but that's truly what happened in this case.
Yeah, and it takes a leap of faith, because you never know. I mean, you plot something out, you know where it's going, you know where you're headed ultimately. And without doing that, I think this is real writing, where you have faith that they're going to take you to the place ultimately that they want to go. And I think that's, part of the reason why this novel feels so authentic and so well written. So let me bring up a question we have from Sheila. And she says, have you had any feedback on the book from Iranians?
I have, not many, but I have. In one of the early workshops, one of my classmates was from Iran, and she was very positive about the early chapters and felt that they were authentic. And more recently, I've had feedback from some young Iranians who were born in this country, who really developed an emotional connection to this book because it felt it provided more nuance to life in the days of the Shah. It gave them more color than the stories they heard from their families. So I had good feedback so far, and I'm hoping that continues. I'm keeping my fingers crossed.
And they have a very young population as well. I think a majority are under 30. So perhaps if they were open to publishing this in Iran, it might find an audience.
It tells me that the censors there would not approve it, but I think hopefully they will be generous with this book because it's written from the point of view of an expatriate.
So speaking of that, Trevin has a question about how do you think expat life has changed as the world has become more globalized?
That's an interesting question because, in the past, you were just thrown into a new world, an unfamiliar world, and you reached out. And I was talking to a friend of mine who was also an expatriate in South America at the same time. And you do develop these interesting relationships, like with your driver. That's a very common relationship because that's the person who you spend local person you spend a lot of time with, who helps you with the language, a guide to customs,
and one of the best characters in your story too.
Thank you. But some of my expatriate friends immediately connected with that relationship and the connection between the two of them. And so, and also you then really do, I guess you do sort of join into these international groups. There's a lot of mingling between expatriates of all kinds, in sort of athletic events, social events. So you have, if you go to a major city like New York or London and you're an expatriate, there's a high probability that most of your friends will be people from your own background. Whereas if you go to an expatriate, if you're an expatriate in a country like Iran or a similar country, you would find that you really become friends with all other expatriates. And I wonder if today, given that you can stay connected and so much with your home country, and you can easily fly back and forth, and communication is so cheap. In those days, it was really hard and expensive to call internationally. So you were pretty much thrown into that world. I suppose it's more a global world today and not these expatriate silos. That's what I would say. And I'd give you a quick example. I was flying on the non-stop flight from India with the head of Adobe India on the United flight. And he says, it's amazing what this flight has done. He says, I can now come to America and attend Adobe meetings, every few days, 10 days, 7 days, whatever, and go back to work in India. It's sort of, you don't really become a true expatriate anymore. Mm-hmm. Possibly. I mean, I posit that as one of the changes.
So it looks like we're coming into the home stretch with the last question here, which Shandab asked Madhav, what is your next novel about? Maybe Gaby or the future adventures of Ayan?
Well, maybe my next novel, my family doesn't really, is not really, doesn't want to hear this answer because, and I totally understand, because they want me to focus on more important things, real things. But because novel writing does take up a lot of your time. But I'm mulling a story set really in the financial world. So instead of the Iranian Revolution as a backdrop, the role of the buccaneer financier in the last 15, 20 years, be it hedge funds, Silicon Valley venture capitalists, private equity people, and the amazing wealth creation and inevitable corruption, treachery, personal growth, relationships. I'm mulling that over and waiting for a character like Ayan or Gaby. And when I mentioned this at actually a Washington, D.C. book club, I got a note back from the head of the book club, don't even think of having a protagonist other than Ayan. You got to continue his story in this, in this new framework. But let's see where that goes.
Uh-huh. So let me just ask one last question. And it has to do with kind of the process. So this was your first novel, and you're in your cave, you're writing this, you have no idea if it's any good or not. It takes a tremendous amount of courage to just show it to anybody. What was the process that you kind of went through to get the help that you needed in order to craft it in a way ultimately where it was published?
Well, my wife will tell you, Fred, that I'm not lacking in confidence, particularly about my writing. But she did not know how, you do worry because you are creating you in this make-believe world. And one of the best things I did, actually as a suggestion of a college friend of mine, was to join the Stanford writers programs and the courses. And I said, I dipped a toe in by attending an afternoon, Saturday afternoon session on writing your first novel with a wonderful gentleman called Rusty Dolman. I hope I'm pronouncing his name right. And you had to write a page or two and share it with your class. And I wasn't laughed out. It was like good feedback. And said, okay, I'll dare to start another, and then go into more and more. And then eventually these workshops were absolutely central to really testing out your skills, your characters. It took a long time, but I attended many classes, at Stanford. I had a wonderful writing group that I've acknowledged in my book. And as a result of that feedback, and I suggest this as a possible path for every aspiring first-time novelist, these workshops were invaluable. They tend to be they tend to know how to give you criticism, so they don't destroy you. And you do hear what you need to hear, but it encourages you to keep going.
Great. On that note, I'm going to turn this back over. Thanks, Madhav. It's a wonderful book, a real page turner, and congratulations. Let me turn this back over to Kathy.
Thanks, Fred.
Wow, that was great. I just started this, so now with all the details that were, and the writing is excellent, Madhav, and I just totally am. This is what I'm doing. See, this is a good recuperation thing, and I just want to say to everyone, now I think you should be convinced that this is something that you'd like to spend the summer, maybe not many days, because it is a page turner. It is available at Book Passage. You can go in there, the store is open, get yourself a copy, and it obviously has so much the politics and the story and the intrigue, and now we know the backstory. So this has been just a marvelous hour, and thank you both. Fred, was fabulous questions, and thank you from the audience for hanging in there and asking great questions and getting this very stimulating conversation. So thank you again for joining Book Passage. We will see you at future events. Please again check bookpassage.com for upcoming events, and thank you both for this wonderful hour, and have a great evening, you guys and everyone else, and signing off.
Thank you, Book Passage.